All right, so let me just quickly welcome you. If we haven't met in person, I'm Paul. Welcome to New Story Church. I've been a pastor here for 15 years. And so the first year I came here, I met John, not his real name. He was a young guy, loved Jesus, loved basketball. And he was a coach at a local Christian college. And he showed up at our church one day. I pulled him into my small group, drug him along with me onto a missions trip to Bulgaria. But like a lot of us, there was something in John that just, you could feel it. It made it really hard for him to receive love, to receive God's love, some type of shame or some type of fear that he carried with him. But you could also see in him like this deep passion for Jesus and this desperate love of grace. Like when he experienced grace, you just see it in him. But then one day, just like out of nowhere, he just stopped showing up. After years of small groups, serving, being part of our church family, just nothing. And so I was like, where's John? So I finally hunted him down and found out a couple months later that someone had seen him going into a gay bar in Philly, and he got fired from his job. And now he felt like he could no longer show his face at our church. And so I was deeply grieved. I was grieved that my friend had been struggling with this silently for so long, and I had no idea. And I was grieved that he felt like if he came back to our church, we would reject him. But as I sat with it, it made me wonder, is John right? Like if he had come and just shared his struggles with us while he was in a small group, while he was going on mission trips, while he was serving, how would our church have responded? Like, would we have loved him? Would we have been able to walk alongside him? Would we have known how to shepherd his soul? So that was 11 years ago, and I've been wrestling with that question ever since. So you're invited here tonight because you're shepherds. And I know a lot of you do not go by the title of pastor, but you are shepherding people in your sphere of ministry, whether it's through like a small group or second grade class or men's ministry, women's ministry, college, counseling, something. You shepherd someone. And the issues of like gender and sexuality, they affect us all. So for the sake of our people, for the sake of our community, for the sake of Jesus' name in our community, we need to learn how to shepherd our people well. And so in that spirit, I'd like to just to suggest, I mean, you guys are all leaders, so I'm really comfortable with this conversation, but want to suggest a couple guidelines just as we think through this. One is I would just encourage us to let's address people and not debate issues. Tonight, this is not a debate over theology, scripture interpretation, biology, psychology. Tonight is about shepherding people. So the question tonight that we want to ask is like, how do we love John? How do we care for him in a way that is truly loving, like walking with him, caring for him, speaking the truth in love? The second thing is just want to say that all sincere questions are welcome, but sometimes I want you to just recognize that sometimes the answer we most need is different than the question we're asking. So Jesus does this all the time, right? Who is my neighbor? And he's like, there was once a man walking along the road. And you're like, ah. So tonight, the answer you might get might not be the answer you want, but it might be the answer you need. So expect some of that. And then the third thing is I just want you to recognize that shepherding requires managing tensions. So Psalm 23 gives us this beautiful picture of the good shepherd leading us, right, to this open, spacious, green pastures where it is spacious and there's rest and there's provision. But then Acts chapter 20, also using the shepherding metaphor, the Apostle Paul warns the elders of Ephesus that there are fierce wolves that will devour the sheep. And there's a tension in this. So sometimes I draw this picture for tonight. You can imagine it. So imagine there's this green pasture where the sheep are designed to flourish. They're made to flourish. But on one side, there's like this cliff they could fall off. On the other side, there's this dark woods with these fierce wolves in it. And so there's different approaches, like how do we keep the sheep in this green pasture? Some like to build a giant fence and a very small pen to keep the sheep in, because they think that if we do that, they'll be safe, there'll be no danger. Then the wolves can't get to them. And it's true, the wolves can't get to them, but it's also true that there will be no freedom. And if you've ever experienced churches or ministries that do that, that keep the sheep very pinned up in a very small pen, you know that all the little ones end up dying. Their faith dies because they need freedom. They need green pastures. The other option, and you can come up with some names right now, other people say, let's do away with all boundaries. Let's tear down those fences. Let the sheep go wherever they want. And they end up falling off the cliff and getting eaten by wolves. So there's a tension in this. Tonight, we want to be wary of thinking that the answer is building big fences or tearing them down. You don't have to agree with everything Dr. Yarhouse has to say tonight. I'm not sure if I will. And that's okay. But I want you to recognize the tension here. The aim is not that everyone walks out of here with the exact same boundary lines. The aim is that the flock is kept safe. So with that, I just want to set this conversation before God in prayer. First, I want to lead you in something we do every single Sunday. It's a listening practice. So if you would, just put your feet flat on the floor, sit in an open listening position, close your eyes, and ask God to speak to you. I'll close this here in a minute, and then I'll lead us through a reading. Father, thank you that you have not left us alone, that you have sent your Son as a good shepherd to come after us, that you've given us your Spirit to guide us. I prayed that your Spirit would lead this conversation tonight. I pray this in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Amen. And just to set the tone, if you would, join me in praying in unison Psalm 23. I'll have it in the version that I prefer, but if you know it in another one, you just go for it. Good? Let's pray this together. Let's see if my iPad's going to work. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen. So Dr. Mark Yarhouse is a clinical psychologist, author of over 20 books, follower of Jesus, professor at Wheaton Seminary, and he directs the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute there. His team studies the experiences of LGBTQ plus people in Christian contexts and then helps churches and schools think carefully about how to care well for them, and that is exactly why we brought him here tonight. So with that, if you would, let's give him a warm welcome.
All right, thank you. Well, thanks for having me here. What a delight to connect with you. traveling from Chicago to Philadelphia is always a little fraught this time of year, but glad we could get in today and looking forward to our time together. When I joined the church that I'm in several years ago now, but my wife and I were asked, would you lead a home group for LGBTQ Christians or people here in our church? And we said, sure, we could. I think we were led to believe that there were quite a large number. It wasn't quite like that, but there were, we certainly wanted to offer to do it. So we met at someone's house. It was a home group. And do you know half the people who attended did not go to the church? They just heard about it. And they were like, going to someone's home was as close as they were going to come to going to a church. Going back to a church was not on the things that they wanted to do in that upcoming year. It was not a New Year's resolution, let me put it that way. So it's very interesting. Most did not want to pray, but most wanted prayer. There were just some insights that you start to think about when you think of ministry to this population that are different than most other populations you think of. Now, I know that most of you are leaders in this church or in a church, and so leadership just needs to probably think a little more creatively about points of contact with the community, because I don't know that just ministering to regular attenders is going to be the angle of entry for most of us in this space. But by being a part of a church, you definitely will come across people who are navigating these questions of sexuality or gender. And to prepare us for that, I think whatever scope of ministry you're a part of, I think would be good. So, as was mentioned, I direct the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute. Okay, so my understanding... Okay. So is there anything okay, we did it. Okay, good. All right, so at Wheaton College, so this is about a dozen PhD, clinical psych students, counseling, family therapy, undergrad psych majors who conduct research on that intersection of either religious identity, usually Christians, and either sexual or gender identity. And we have an outward-facing clinic. We serve the community. We do consultations for parents, and I do gender evaluations with adolescents and adults. And so those are the kind of things that we spend quite a bit of time doing. There's some contact information below if you'd like. You probably want to hear me first before you commit to anything like that. But if you want to, you're welcome to. I want to talk about a couple foundational considerations, just so we're on the same page. In your seat, you have a handout, and I'd like to invite you to look at that with me. And this is something you can just kind of jot down some notes as you have them. You could take it home and jot them down, but just wanted us to be able to think together about some things. And I want to start with just assumptions coming into the conversation. So think about the experiences you have had with people navigating either sexual identity or gender identity. So I should explain that. So sexual identity is just, it's labeling yourself based on your sexual attractions. And so when someone says that they're gay or lesbian or straight for that matter, they're using terminology called sexual identity. So when I use that phrase, I'm talking about gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer typically. And then gender identity usually refers to how you experience yourself as a man or a woman or a different experience than that. And so that brings you into the transgender and non-binary conversation. So when I use gender identity, that's just kind of shorthand for transgender, non-binary. So what are the assumptions I have? Maybe I assume that people who identify as gay feel what? Or maybe I assume that a young person who identifies as trans means what? So maybe this is just assumptions. And how has the broader culture changed in its views towards people navigating sexual or gender identity? And part of that, you could probably think of like the Supreme Court's ruling around gay marriage. You could probably think of entertainment and industry like that. You could think of other ways in which maybe cultures change, and there's kind of signifiers of how culture has changed. That might be one way to think about it. And then the other would be, how has the Christian community changed? Like, what has been your experience around these topics and around young people, maybe from media, family, friends, faith community, personal experience? What's that look like? Okay, so jot down a couple of assumptions just to kind of get us thinking about that. And then as you, and again, you can fill this in a little bit more later, but just as you kind of jot down a few assumptions, I'd like you to turn to beliefs and values. What beliefs do I hold about sexual and gender identity? Like maybe you would say, I believe gender is fluid, or I believe sexual orientation is biologically determined, or I believe the opposite of that. Maybe I think it is the product of environment, or maybe I think gender is fixed. Where do my beliefs come from? Is this from your faith as a Christian? Cultural traditions, personal experiences, knowing people in this space, or maybe it's your own personal experience. Maybe it's academic knowledge, you've studied this. And then are there values that guide your interactions with other people in this space? Would you say that a value that guides you is something like compassion, like to suffer with? Is it respect for diversity? Is that kind of an orienting framework for you? Is it commitment to truth? You know, what do I believe and hold to be true? Or maybe related to that, is it faithfulness to God's word? And then, how can my values help me engage more thoughtfully and respectfully with, again, sexual and gender identity as topics, and with the people who are navigating questions around sexual or gender identity? So whatever those maybe if it's respect for diversity, commitment to truth, if it's compassion, how do my values help me engage in a thoughtful and respectful way? So it's a little bit of an audit for ourselves, kind of what are we coming in thinking about there? And then let's also try to tackle fears and anxieties, or at least identify them. What anxieties related to these topics do I have coming into this time together? Like a common one would be, I don't want our church to go down a slippery slope on this topic. Another common one would be, I don't want our church to be a source of harm to young people who experience same-sex attraction. And then, so maybe jot down, you might have 3 or 4 kind of sources of anxiety or topics that are maybe a little hard for you. I think for some people, they just don't even know what to say. They're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing and offend somebody, or kind of dig a hole they can't get back out of, so they just don't say anything. Or it's so polarizing, you don't want to say anything because you're worried people around you are constantly sort of scrutinizing what's said and what it could mean, and you don't want to say something that puts you in one side or the other. And then with whom might I be able to discuss those anxieties? Could I talk to a friend, maybe someone else in the room who's in a leadership role, or another church leader that you think, you experience that you could trust? And the last piece for now is just expectations, right? So what do I hope to learn or gain from our conversation tonight on sexual or gender identity? So those might have been like questions that you came in with. Maybe you submitted those. Maybe you're holding that and going to ask later, or maybe you'll have that question as we go. And I would say, good for you. I'm an introvert. I think of my questions like in the parking lot on the way home. So if you can think of your questions while we're here, I love that. That's amazing. I admire that. What expectations do I have for myself during this conversation? Maybe I'll just listen openly, or I'll discuss this topic with the respect that it's due. And maybe what expectations do I have for other people, like the facilitators and participants? I hope others will be respectful. I expect this person talking to me to provide accurate information. I mean, that's a good one. I think that's a reasonable one to have. Okay, so I wanted you to just kind of take some time and jot down some things. And you can continue as I'm talking. You can do it later. Whatever is best for you at this point. Now, I want to turn our attention to three lenses through which I think people approach these conversations. And I'm going to invite you, as another source of kind of reflection, another opportunity for reflection, which of these lenses resonates with you? Now, I want to give you a little bit of context for this. I wrote this out when I was working on a book that would be published in 2015. It's called Understanding Gender Dysphoria. And I was doing a lot of youth training around 2010, 2011, and I would be at the National Youth Workers Convention, other places, doing a lot of like workshops or pre-conference workshops, and it was mostly on sexual identity, really exclusively. Like, how do you be a youth minister to a gay youth who's 14, 15, 16 in youth ministry? What does that look like? And then about that time, I've been doing it for many years, but it was about 2012 or so, all of a sudden, all of the Q&A switched from questions about gay youth to questions about gender. Questions about gender identity, transgender youth, non-binary youth. And I realized that youth ministers were signaling to me a shift in the culture. And that, so I have worked with gay and lesbian issues since 1998, professionally licensed psychologist. But I had always worked with gender identity concerns, but it was so rare. You would not see it that often. So I hardly ever thought I would write about it. It's just something you did clinically, and you worked with people, and it was hard, and it was challenging work, but not something that I would ever have thought would become central in the cultural discourse. And so here were youth pastors telling me this is happening. So I went to my publisher with a proposal for a book to write that I thought I would never write. And they passed it around their editorial office, as they do, to see if they're going to, offer a contract. And they wrote back and said, we all, as a group, know gay neighbors and family members and friends, but I have to tell you, none of us knows anybody who's transgender. Are you sure there's an audience for this book? It's a good question to ask. It sounds kind of funny today, but I assured them this is a wave that's going to crest on the church, and the church is not prepared for this conversation. So I think because I'd published with them before, they just issued me a contract just to kind of keep me happy. But and this book was published the same month that Caitlyn Jenner transitioned. It just as one of those kind of indicators of the cultural shift. Newsweek would later describe the transgender tipping point, and had Laverne Cox on the cover of that issue from Orange is the New Black. And so anyway, when I was writing that book, I was trying to understand why so many people disagreed with each other. And I came up with three lenses that I'm going to introduce you to. And a friend of mine who's a gay cleric in the UK, he's celibate, and he read a draft of this book and said, these lenses are really helpful for me in ministry. That's why I'm going to share them with you. But he said, as a gay man, they're really helpful for me around my sexuality too, not just gender. So I've begun to sort of bring it into that conversation, but you'll hear as I go through it, it maps on a little better to gender dysphoria and identity than it does being gay. But I'll share it with you in the leadership sense of like maybe thinking through this together. But the first lens I described as a lens of integrity. And every time I do this, I'm going to use the word of a proponent of that perspective. So this person that I was citing is a New Testament theologian who was talking about male-female distinctions that you see in the stories of creation in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And so it's the relationship between male and female, the coming together in the covenant of marriage that establishes the parameters around which genital sexual activity is morally permissible in marriage. And behavior outside of that would be morally impermissible, and further, adopting a cross-gender or other gender identity would go against the integrity of the male-female differences God intended at creation. Okay, so we call that in the integrity lens. I could have also called it sacred. I use that quite a bit too. Okay, so I want you to begin to think, does that resonate with me? Is that kind of where I would land? I'm not sure I want to commit. What are the other two lenses? Okay, I get you. Okay, so the second lens I described as a disability lens. And this is more like something's not functioning properly. And this maps on better to gender because there's an actual diagnosis here called gender dysphoria. So there's not something like that equivalent with being gay, right? But people here would say, when your biological sex and your experience of your gender are misaligned and they're discordant and it's distressing to you, something's not lining up right, something's not functioning properly. But it's not a moral issue like you see in the integrity lens. It's more of a non-moral reality we should respond to with compassion. So Christians drawn to this would say, I'm drawing more on the story of the fall in Genesis 3. I believe in creation, 1 and 2, Genesis, but my orienting framework comes more out of the reality of we live in a fallen world, and that's why there might be that discordance. And so I would say this group is characterized more by compassion, more empathy comes forward. So it's not like a sin or a concern to be corrected. It's not like maybe an Augustinian sense of restoring creational intent. It's more of a, what does it mean to grow into maturity and Christ-likeness with a besetting reality? Maybe more Irenaean, if you will, in that sense. So anyway, you have these two lenses. And again, I'm using the word of a proponent. One friend of mine who's gay took me out of the gay debate into the deaf debate to kind of make this point. She was saying in the deaf community, it's a very distinct group of people. Some view this as a disability, a medical condition, and it deeply influences how they think about what's best for their care. And there's other people who see being deaf as a culture to be celebrated. It's very distinct which group you're a part of. And that brings us to the third lens. The third lens would be the idea that it's not a moral concern to be corrected. It's not a condition to be empathized with. It reflects a culture to be celebrated. And this would be, this is my field, mainstream of my field of psychology, the mainstream of education. Many influential disciplines within education and academia embrace this third lens and would view, and many churches have shifted in their thinking towards this view of celebrating these differences as reflecting a culture. Okay? And so I think here, Christians drawn to this, I don't know that they're citing so much a specific like Genesis 1 or Genesis 3, but there's one person I'm just thinking of right now whose position is more like, yes, God created the land and the sea, but he also created marshes and swamps. Yes, God created the land animals and the animals of the sea, but he also created amphibians. So it's not like the things in between are the result of the fall. It's more like we're just told about the things, but there's other things too that are left out, but they're not fallen. And so you get that maybe from that third lens, okay? So I just want to invite you to think, okay, what am I drawn to of these three lenses? Okay, I want you to think about that as a leader. What am I drawn to and why? Now, if I were to reflect on these lenses, part of ministry is this. Can we love and respect people who see through a different lens? I would say that the helpfulness of the lenses is that they exist throughout society. They exist in most churches to some extent, but proportionally, based on whether a church is more conservative, more liberal, those types of things. And then I think they certainly coexist within families, and that's what I do. I meet with families, and I invite them to do what I'm asking you to do, to identify which lens, Mom, which lens do you resonate with? How about for you, Dad? How about for your daughter, for your son? And so we're having this conversation. So that's a ministry tip, is that you can use this sometimes in ministry because it lets people have a name for a set of assumptions they might not have been able to articulate, and it helps people not talk past each other so much. I don't know if you've been in ministry with a family where you feel like things are just escalating and people are just locking horns or they're going to their neutral corners, and that you just like, why are we talking past each other so much? And it doesn't settle the differences, but it gives you some sense of what those differences might be. And then from a ministry standpoint, you can invite them each to share with you and with each other. I do this in families all the time. Mom, could you share with your husband, your daughter, how this lens you just named, how that came to resonate with you, how that came to capture your imagination or your convictions or kind of where you are. And now Mom, especially in a family that's conflicted, for the first time might be able to say, I think it's because of this. And my job is to keep everyone else from jumping in, because that's what happens in the kitchen at home, is it gets going to escalate. So I kind of, hey, I wonder if we could let Mom finish her thought there. It's a kind of an active ministry moment. And then maybe the husband learned something he had not heard from his wife, because they don't talk about it in as constructive a way as now they are in ministry. Then you can ask maybe the dad to do the same thing, and he, talks through some of those things. And then their 15-year-old, you can invite her. I wonder if you could. But instead of like being corrected, which is often how parents feel kind of an obligation, we're disagreeing, I need her to know that's not the right answer, you can protect that from happening and let her articulate this a little bit more so it can breathe a little bit. You're not losing an argument by letting someone share what their experiences are and why they're there. I mean, wouldn't you in ministry want to at least be attuned to what motivates somebody to be where they are? Like, what's compelling about that? And could you listen for that and maybe help each other have a better understanding for that before you move into, where do we go with all that? Now, I'm sometimes asked, can people adopt more than one lens? I would say yes. In fact, if you were to look at that book, I just actually updated it, so it's in its second edition now. But it's the main point here is I'm going to tell you all about it, so you don't have to worry about it. But what I tell the reader is to think about what the best elements of each lens is. And maybe there's a way to integrate those best elements into an integrated lens rather than pick one to the exclusion of the other two. And maybe you sat here thinking, I don't know that I want one. I think I want two. Okay, yes, okay, great. Maybe even three. But we can talk that through a little bit. Can they be integrated at all is a question. And I don't think in a room this size we would have consensus on how to integrate the best qualities of them. I can share how I do that, but I could imagine we might land in slightly different places thinking about the best of each of them. Okay. And then, so these are the benefits. I've kind of mentioned this already. I do think one thing I'd add that I didn't is that I think it helps facilitate what psychologists call cognitive complexity, which means helping you see through the eyes of the other person. That's a good quality. Seeing through someone else's eyes is a great quality for a ministry leader. Seeing through the eyes of the other does not mean you agree with them, but it kind of, a light bulb goes off. Oh, okay, because you're kind of assuming when you're in ministry that the people you're ministering to are reasonable, rational people. Now you might say, well, he hasn't met so-and-so. Okay, I get that. But if you're, like most people in ministry, you realize the people I'm ministering to in my home group in this are rational people, and they land on things for reasons that I'd like to understand better. That's kind of really where we're going with that. Oh, yeah, let me tell you one story about this. So how many of you know who Jazz Jennings is? Okay, a handful of people. Okay, a few people. So Jazz Jennings is one of the youngest documented cases of a biological male who was raised as a girl since Jazz was probably 4 or 5. And today, Jazz is an adult. She is transgender. She's transitioned since a young age. And she has had her own reality show called I Am Jazz. Well, for many years, Barbara Walters, before Barbara passed away, would visit this family. And so you would see her meeting them. And so when Jazz was very young, she went to the family's home. And then a few years later, I think Jazz is about 11, and Barbara goes back to meet with the family for a follow-up. So now she's meeting with Jazz and Jazz's older sister and older twin brothers. And she just has the siblings with Jazz there. And she says, how do you explain Jazz to your friends? And the older sister takes that question and she says, you know what? I tell my friends that it's a disorder and it's not something that she chose. Well, Barbara Walters had been doing this for many years and she knows what just happened. So she turns to Jazz and says, Jazz, what's it like for you to hear your sister talk about you that way? And Jazz says, I don't like that word, disorder, because I think to be transgender is to be special or unique because that's who I am. Okay, let's back up in this second. The older sister is drawing on which lens to talk to her friends. It's a disorder. It's not something she chose. Which lens is that? Second lens, right? Disability. It's a disorder. That maps on really well to disability. It's not something that she chose. But do you see what she's doing? She's trying to get ahead of her friends who she thinks might be coming out of something closer to the first lens, like it's willful disobedience. She chose this. And she made a bad set of choices. And if she could just walk those back in repentance, she would no longer be this way, right? It has a little bit of that. Now, not everybody in that first lens would say it that way, but that has a little bit of that quality. So the older sister's like, I'm going to get ahead of that. It's a disorder, not something she chose, okay? So Jazz is obviously hearing both lenses, like don't love what your friends are saying, and I don't love what you're saying. She's drawing on the third lens, right? And it's special, unique. It's who I am. It's who transgender people are. Okay, so and I have to, acknowledge these three lenses are not evenly distributed among people in this space. Most people in this space, gay, transgender people, gravitate towards the third lens of diversity. Now, some would identify more with the first and the second lens. Okay, but it's not a high percentage, a large percentage compared to the diversity. So I think then as a ministry leader, we want to be thinking, okay, that's really helpful. I need to be thinking, why is the third lens so compelling to so many people? Because that's the lens most people are going to be gravitating towards. And if the church wants to step into this space in ministry, it has to be aware of how compelling one lens is. And if the church is more like integrating or over here or this lens, you have to realize you're starting behind the 8 ball here because that's not the lens most people on their own are moving towards, on their own, okay? And you could say, well, I'm just going to minister to people who already have the convictions of the first couple lenses. Okay, I mean, you could do that, but it's going to be a small ministry, and that's okay too. Small ministries can be great, but there's a lot of people you're going to miss, and you're not going to have really ever engaged what's compelling about that other lens. All right, and this brings me to contextualization. I do want us to be thinking about how do you contextualize the gospel. Just as you think about sending people off to another country to bring the gospel to a group of people, I want you to be thinking about contextualizing the gospel, which is to communicate the gospel in word and deed and to establish the church in ways that make sense to people within the local cultural context, presenting Christianity in such a way that it meets people's deepest needs and penetrates their worldview, thus allowing them to follow Christ and remain within their own culture. What I mean by that is I want to make the case that, particularly with the rise of the diversity lens, the LGBTQ community has emerged as a culture within Western society. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It has reached the status of a culture in some ways. Now, when I say that, I don't mean to say that everyone in that community agrees with each other on everything. It's a very diverse group of people. Even the letters, there's a big difference between lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. And there's a big difference between transgender, if you were to go on past Q into I, intersex experiences that are usually tied to medical conditions. And then if you go into asexuality, the A spectrum, there's differences there. So as you go down the list of ways that people identify, you create, yes, a larger, more expansive community, but there's a lot more differences within that community as well. But I'm suggesting by language and values and other elements of a culture, it's emerged as a culture within society, okay? So, then I think that lends itself to thinking more about contextualizing the gospel. Just as you would for sending an international worker to another country to contextualize the gospel there. They would have to learn what? The culture, the cultural mores, the language, the customs, the traditions, the things that hold that community together. You'd have to think about that. I want to encourage you in ministry to be thinking more about that when you think about ministry in this community. 3 functions: to see the gospel message through a different cultural lens, to transform the cultural context of the mainstream gay community, and for the international worker to be personally transformed by the work of God in a new context. I'll say it this way. You would ask any international worker, any missionary, and they will tell you, you have to love the people you're called to. When you think about ministry to LGBTQ people, I want you to ask the question, do I love them? You have to love the people you are ministering to. And if you don't love the people, I want you to start there. That would be a great place for prayer. And to see if God couldn't bring about a sense of deep affection for people in that community. I think that would really help position you, because people get a sense for whether you love them. Okay. In your handout, some key terms. Sexual and gender identity I defined at the beginning because I realized I was using it way before I was defining the term, so we better do that right away. Sex usually refers to biological sex as male or female. It's referencing chromosomes, gonads, genitalia is usually what sex refers to, whereas gender is more like the psychological, social, cultural aspects of being male or female. So when someone says I'm a boy or a girl or a man or a woman, or I have a different experience of my gender than that, that's gender. Gender dysphoria I mentioned, but this is the distress that can be associated with discordance between gender identity and biological markers. So for most people, there is no discordance. There's an alignment. But for a percentage of people, there's misalignment, there's discordance. And when it's distressing, we call it gender dysphoria. So euphoria, positive emotional state; dysphoria, negative emotional state. Transgender is an umbrella term for many ways that people experience, live out, express a gender that's different than normative experiences. And normally, transgender means a cross-gender identity. It's the biological male who says, I'm a woman trapped in the body of a man, okay? Trans meaning spanning across, so yes, it's a cross-gender identity. But the community, transgender community, adopted transgender as their preferred umbrella term for their entire community many years ago. They felt like the existing language of transvestic and transsexual were too psychiatric and pathologizing and medical. So they as a community said, we will be known as transgender for public and political reasons. And so that's an umbrella term. So what I mean by that is if you meet one transgender person, you're meeting one transgender person. It could mean something different to the next person. And it's okay to say something sensitive like, I've known a couple of people who have also identified as trans, and I know it has meant something slightly different to different people, and I wonder what it means to you. Okay, something like that might, genuine curiosity, if you have it, my experience, they'd be willing to talk with you about that. Non-binary is also another umbrella term for people whose experience of their gender is outside of the binary of man, woman, or it's in between in a way that non-binary seems to be a good way to explain it for them. And again, this is a growing area of gender identities in recent years, I would say, for young people especially. And so it's an umbrella term. There can be a lot of different experiences under that. And again, you can ask about that respectfully. This is just to show you that there's a rise in the number of people who are identifying as LGBTQ. And so you can see that the rise is particularly noted among millennials and Gen Z. So in my career, so 1998, for most of my career, it was between 1% and 4% of the population. And only in recent years has it really dramatically risen, particularly in those cohorts, generational cohorts. And so I don't have an answer for why that is. I look at that like you're looking at it, and I say, wow, there's a lot going on there. I don't know what's going on there. So, I mean, this is all what we call cross-sectional. It's just looking at it generationally. I guess the question for me would be, if you track them over time, would those high rates continue for the next 5, 10 years? What would that look like? If you drill deep into the numbers, what makes up that? There's a pretty high percentage of bisexual experiences there represented, and among bisexuals, more females than males. And so, generally speaking, females have been understood to have a more fluid sexuality than males. So there may be some of that going on there. But I think I would just want to wait and see. I don't have a strong reaction to this. I just think it's good information to have. You're going to have higher percentage, more ministry opportunities, more sense of how do we navigate these issues within our community, our schools, our churches, but you're going to have a higher percentage of young people in this space. So for some people, this may be feeling like, yeah, it's about time. Finally, we're here. And other people are more like, that's alarming. I don't want society to go this way. So yeah, I don't have a strong reaction to this, and maybe this is just me who spends time with numbers and just says, well, we'll see what happens, But okay. And then I wanted to also share a designation that exists in Christian circles. This is not so much outside of Christian circles, but there was a group of Christians years ago who wanted to come together in a group called Bridges Across the Divide and have dialogue between Christians who were gay and disagreed with each other. Mostly that was a group called Side A and a group called Side B. Now, what they were trying to avoid is like a conversation about abortion where people say, I'm pro-choice or I'm pro-life, and the way that you frame it tells the other side everything they need to know about you in this political discourse, okay? They didn't want to do that. They didn't want it to be pro-gay and anti-gay. They wanted to use letters to kind of bring down the temperature. So Side A would refer to essentially affirming. You could think of it that way. These would be gay Christians who said, I think that same-sex genital intimacy can be morally permissible in certain contexts, like gay marriage. And their chief dialogue partner in this was Side B, gay Christians who said that genital sexual activity is morally impermissible. So they were conservative, if you will. So they typically were celibate, single people, or they were married to the opposite sex, in which we would call that a mixed orientation marriage, where one is gay and the other person's straight. Okay. Side C was more like I'm trying to figure it out. I'm not sure where I land. Sometimes I just think they're confused or they're trying to figure it out. I don't mean it derogatory, just kind of on their path. So A would be affirming, B would be more so. A would be like Matthew Vines would be a good example of a Side A, or Justin Lee if you're looking for like, I want to read more of that. Side B would be like a Wesley Hill, Ron Belgau, Greg Coles, right? People like that. Side C doesn't tend to write books because they're kind of in a process, so we're just don't know. But Side X would be people who believe not only is the behavior impermissible, but so is the orientation, such that I need to change it. I feel that God's calling me through sanctification to become heterosexual. And so that's more the ex-gay movement. And I think that's still alive and well. It's diminished a little bit, I think, since the closing of Exodus International, and was it maybe 2013 or so? And so that was the largest flagship ministry of ex-gay ministries in the U.S. at the time. They closed, and but there's still ministries out there that are kind of continuing that work. And then side Y would be more close to side X, but they don't really believe that their orientation is likely to change at this point. And so it's more of an enduring reality, but they have the same kind of moral concerns with the orientation as side X does. So they're pretty concerned about that. So both X and Y tend to disidentify with the gay community as a culture. They do not use identity-first language. They would never say, I'm a gay Christian. They would say, I'm ex-gay, or I would say, I have same-sex attractions. SSA would be a very common way to say that. Or they would say, and a good side Y example would be like a Christopher Yuan, if you know him. So it would be like, my identity's in Christ. Okay? Now, to be fair, every other group here would say, my identity's in Christ. These are all Christians who are saying, my identity's in Christ. But for side Y, that's an alternative to an identity-first language. They don't use the word gay. Okay? Whereas side A and side B tend to use the word gay. They tend to identify with some elements of mainstream gay community as a culture by using language like that. We say, well, why would they use language like that if they're Christians? For a lot of reasons. They're using the vernacular. Like if I said to a 16-year-old in your church, you know, what is your sexual orientation? And they said, I'm gay. They would be answering the question, right? Today, gay refers to an orientation and an identity. The word homosexual has really fallen out of the vernacular. It's not even, like if you're a writer and you know like writing guides, you're not even supposed to use the word homosexual in writing. You're supposed to use gay, even though it conflates orientation and identity. It's actually written into the style guides to not use homosexual. So that group does it for that reason. They do it for ministry reasons. They do it to build bridges to their people within the larger gay community. There's a lot of reasons that they do it. But I want you to at least know about this. And you say, well, Mark, what's your letter? Okay, I don't have a letter. This is not part of my personal experience. So I don't use these letters to describe my theology. But it's letters for the people themselves who are gay in dialogue with each other. So that's for them, and then you can have your own. If this doesn't happen to be your experience, you have to find other ways to talk about your theology, and that's fine, right? Okay, and then just a note on mistakes that evangelicals have made in the last 30 years. Okay, so if you're going to be in ministry as a leader, you have to be aware that there's been mistakes made, in my opinion. So I think there's been a lack of understanding and empathy for this community. Now, I'm tracing back to when I was starting out, the AIDS crisis had just kind of been coming to its close in the sense, but in the 80s, early 90s, HIV and AIDS was in some circles widely attributed to gay people's behavior, and Christians seemed very comfortable being a part of that support of that thesis. And I think that association for a lot of people in the gay community did not land well. Okay, it was not a good thing. So lack of understanding, lack of empathy, politicizing things, capitalizing on some of that harsh rhetoric in this area. A lot of harsh rhetoric around the Supreme Court as it was debating marriage and, are gays ruining marriage, and just a lot of things that were said. Now, I'm not saying that Christians shouldn't have been a part of that political discourse, but sometimes our rhetoric mirrors non-Christian rhetoric because of the political interests that Christians sometimes have. And my view is that Christians should always rise above certain types of rhetoric, but still be involved in politics. So, okay, I'm going to leave that there. But failure to adequately address bullying and violence, I think, would be another one. Hyperclaiming theories of causation and hyperclaiming approaches to therapy or ministry. Now, what do I mean by those two things? I think around causation, I'm just going to give you the short answer for the sake of time. We don't know what causes people to become gay in terms of their orientation. But since the early 1990s, the biological hypothesis has been forcefully advanced in twin studies, markers on the X chromosome, prenatal hormonal exposure, a lot of different things. Probably the most recent interesting study I've even seen on this was about 2019, 2020. It was a large genome study with over 500,000 subjects, and it really didn't end up showing like a gay gene in the way people had hoped from that point of view that it would. And so, anyway, in response to all of that had been going on since the early 1990s, a lot of times in the church, people held on to two primary theories that they were drawn to. So one theory was parent-child relationships, and the other was sexual abuse. So let me walk through this really quickly because it affects ministry. The parent-child relationship comes from a kind of Freudian idea that there's an emotional deprivation that occurs when the same-sex parent is either absent or emotionally unavailable or things of that nature. And so there becomes this deprivation towards the same sex that as the child then goes through puberty becomes sexualized. It's kind of a Freudian notion. And there really isn't good research to support this claim. It's a very interesting claim. And I guess what's most interesting to me is that Christians have not historically warmed to Freud. But on this one thing, they're like, yeah, we're going to hang on to that theory. I just don't see the evidence for this at all. A number of people, straight people, have emotional deprivations with the same-sex parents. So as a theory of causation, it really doesn't hold water. And then, but the idea then would be you'd have a therapeutic corrective relationship where those emotional needs are met, and you could then become straight. So you hyperclaimed the theory without much evidence, and then you hyperclaimed the solution, which was come to therapy or ministry and have those needs met, and you'll become straight, right? So the same thing happened with sexual abuse. So sexual abuse as a cause of people being gay, and then if we work through the trauma of that abuse, you'll become straight. So hyperclaiming kind of went together, causation and ministry or treatment. So now as a psychologist, what I would say is if someone came to me and did not have a good relationship with their same-sex parent, I would help them with that. But I would never claim that it's why they're gay, and I would never claim that at the end of therapy you'd become straight. I would just help them with the relationship that they have. And yes, a higher percentage of adults who are gay, lesbian, transgender do report a history of sexual abuse, yes. And sexual abuse complicates sexuality for people, yes, obviously. But if someone came to me, I would help them with the negative, sequelae of trauma from that experience, but I wouldn't say it made you gay. I think it complicated sexuality for you, but I wouldn't say it's a reliable pathway to a sexual orientation that's been demonstrated through all this research. It's just not. But if I helped you with it, I wouldn't claim that you'd now become straight. I would just help you with trauma. There was no need to hyperclaim these two things. But I think evangelicals really ended up doing that in ways that further made the relationship with the gay community difficult. All right, so how do we then, as leaders, model how to engage these topics in a polarized culture? I'm going to suggest that there are two ways that most Christians do this. The first is a culture warrior. Most examples, because they get on podcasts and they get on stage and they're funded well, most examples that Christians see would be a culture warrior. We are at war with people around these issues. And so I think any movement that feels threatening to Christianity or threatening to norms around Christianity become a source of attack against God or against convictions. So we're at war with those people. So even moments of compassion and understanding, there's probably, people sometimes hear me talking about this and they're not expecting the tone. And so it feels like, does that mean, is he really pro-gay? We start to do it ourselves within Christian context. You're either pro-gay or you're anti-gay. And I would say, don't be subject to the polarizing framing of these issues in society. The Christian is called to rise above that discourse. So it's not about being pro-gay or anti-gay. It's being pro the image of God in all people. And what does ministry look like from that vantage point? That's what I want to push you towards. Now, the opposite of this, and they're related, would be the cultural capitulator. Now, what I mean by that is the other end of that are people who seem to say, okay, so there's 100 gender identities, there's 100 different sexual identities. Okay, thanks for the update. I'm gonna play another round of 18 holes of golf. I mean, they don't even. It's like they don't. It's like they don't want to bring the Christian worldview at all into the conversation. They just want you to update them on where we are and go on. Like it's just, okay, that sounds good. We're doing that. We're doing 100. Okay, good. And so it's. This, when warriors hear that, it fuels warriors. And when capitulators hear warriors, they're like, yeah, I'm good. I'm over here. So it's like neither of these, I think, are good indications of how Christians should be representing the kingdom of God here on earth. So what I would argue for is from 2 Corinthians 5, we are to be ambassadors. The Apostle Paul names us as ambassadors. We are representing one kingdom to a culture that is increasingly unfamiliar with the language and categories we use around sexuality and gender and why we use them. And so the ambassador's job is to represent those things with conviction, with civility, and with compassion. So those are the 3 C's that I would use to help us orient ourselves towards ambassadorship. Now, I'm borrowing here from Richard Mouw. He was the former president at Fuller Theological Seminary, and he wrote a book called Uncommon Decency, and he talks about we need convicted civility among Christians. His observation was we have far too many Christians who are so strong on convictions, but you wouldn't want them to represent you in society because they're just not nice people. On the other hand, you have Christians who are so strong on civility, you have no idea what they believe in. You need Christians with convicted civility. The only thing I added, maybe because I'm a psychologist, is compassion. If this is not your experience, it's really wise to think, what would it be like to experience this and to grow up in a church and hear people talk about gay people the way that they do sometimes? They're an abomination. Okay? They're all going to hell. They're ruining marriage. And then you're 14 and you're in the narthex hearing that saying, man, they're talking about people like me. Do you think they're more or less likely to share that than with their youth pastor? Well, less likely. In fact, we've done a study where we looked at what are called milestone events. When do people on average first know that they have these attractions? Their awareness of these attractions is about age 13. When do they first disclose that to anybody? And I'm talking about a Christian sample, all Christians who are gay, essentially. The average age of telling anybody was 17. That tells me that they're on average going 4 years between I'm aware of this as I go through puberty and I'm going to dare to tell somebody about this. Do you know how much ministry could have helped, been a part of their life for 4 years? Do you know what the formula of 4 years of silence is? What you get from that? Well, you get shame. Shame is not guilt, like I did something wrong. Shame is a more pernicious sense that there's something fundamentally flawed in me, and I'm responsible for it because everyone around me is telling me I'm responsible for it. And so the best thing to do with shame is to let it breathe in a safe relationship with someone who can reflect God's heart for you, right? That God loves you. So I'm going to say just a couple things about this. I would say, try to identify your anxieties, as I mentioned earlier. And maybe, what are my fears here? What are my anxieties? I think most people in ministry would say, I didn't minister at my best when I ministered out of fear. And so one of the things that I want to do is reduce fear-based ways of ministering to people in this space. And that's a good invitation to just talk with each other about what those fears are, pray about what those fears are. We want to reduce fear-based ways of relating. And there's a couple tips I can give you. I can't do justice to this tonight, but what are some, maybe physically, how I handle my anxieties is I avoid the topic, or I avoid this, or I just don't go there. I would say don't think of your anxieties as threatening to your safety. I would say try to lean into them a little bit more. Maybe break down situations and rate how hard those are, and maybe work on some of the lower rated ones to build some confidence around anxiety in this space. Maybe just bringing it up with a friend would be lower rated than something else, like teaching a class or something. Lean into the lower rated sources of anxiety and let yourself maybe feel that fear, feel that anxiety, so you realize it's not as bad. Usually the anticipation is worse than the experience. And being able to process it as leaders with each other, with others in the church, can be helpful. GB here just means governing board, like a leadership. I don't know what you call your leadership team here, but our church calls it a governing board. But invite God into the place where you're feeling vulnerable and fearful through prayer. Let God work in your heart around that. I would say compassion and anxiety would be another couple, and empathy would be another thing. If this is not your experience, be especially aware of how lack of empathy comes through. I remember meeting with a father whose child, boy, had grown up, and now he was like 13 or 14, and he said something like this in the session: all his life he was a boy, and last month he decides he's a girl. Okay? All right. So it was a good opportunity to do a little bit of gently talking with Dad about what the experience is like. I don't think the discordance that this person's son is reporting is just a cognitive shift that they're having, like my favorite color used to be green and now it's blue. And a lot of times people think that it's just an irrational thought, and if you just disputed them, they would change their belief. And there's just no evidence in treatment that is what helps people. A lot of times people say, well, just tell them that they're really a boy. Okay. Do you think that's never happened? Do you think no one's ever done that? Do you think that's not been looked at? It's been looked at. It doesn't work that way. And I can talk with you about, those types of things later if it's helpful to you. But so a little more compassion, a little more empathy in this space, I think would be good. On the area of convictions, but also vision, I would point you to C.S. Lewis. You might say, well, he didn't ever talk about this. There's one letter he wrote about homosexuality. It was a letter he wrote, and it's in a book called A Severe Mercy, if you'd like to read it, by Sheldon Van Auken. And Sheldon and his wife, when they became Christians, they were asked if they would lead a Bible study for new Christians. And they were like, wait a minute, we just became Christians. We should ask people to be right. And they said, no, we really need you. So they did for college students. Well, they were doing it for a few months, and a few of the students who were gay came to them and asked them, what is the meaning of the gospel for people like us? So they did what a lot of people would do. They wrote to a learned Christian person, and they asked him that question. Now, his wife, her name's Davy, she had a class with C.S. Lewis, and so she knew him, so she wrote to him. And it's his response that is the only time he ever talks about this topic. And he says, the reason I have map out the boundaries is the part that he talks about this is he says, to map out the boundaries within which all conversation must take place. Meaning, what's the frame? What's the frame? And he says, I take it for certain that acting on homosexual desires would be sin. But that leaves that person no worse off than anyone else who's prevented from marrying. The disciples were not told why in John 9, why the man was born blind, in terms of the actual cause. They were only told the final cause. Remember, the disciples said, is it his sin or is it the parent's sin that he's blind? And we're not told that. We're told The final cause is that God's works can be made manifest in him. So what Lewis does is he takes John 9 and he maneuvers it towards purpose, meaning, vocation. So if I'm in ministry, what I'm hearing from Lewis is not only map out the boundaries of your convictions around sexuality and gender, that's important, but then within those boundaries, let you be creative for ministry. And his creative outlet was help them find purpose and meaning and vocation in it. You see, you can't just say to somebody, good luck with your sexuality, or good luck with that discordance around your gender, or I hope you can find a way. Ministers, people in ministry, help them find purpose, meaning, vocation. What does that look like for that young person to flourish? And then I'm just going to drop a little bit of this on you. This is Anne Lamott. She and I disagree on a number of things on this topic, actually, but I love this quote. You don't always have to chop with the sword of truth. You can point with it, too. Now, she is not talking about these issues because she would say it differently if she were. But I will say this. Sometimes in Christian ministry, we're swinging the sword of truth left and right, and it's a weapon. And I love the idea that you can point with it. I think a lot of my most helpful ministry is pointing with my life towards things that are true. Like that God is a good and loving Father who loves this person, that they are beloved by God, that God wants a relationship with them. And you don't have to swing a weapon to do that. You can point with a sword to do that. So how much does my life point to the things that I think are true, that I'm convicted are true in my heart? I love that idea. It's really helped me quite a bit. Show up for them and their friends. Be curious about the people they love. I think that's good. And then just lastly, think about parents in this space. If you want to you have a heart for ministry, but you're not sure where it should land, an area of great need is parents. When their kids come out, they're the least talked about, least ministered to group in this whole conversation. My field hardly writes about them. It's all about the young person, and I get that. That's important. But do you know the parent-adolescent relationship is one of the best predictors of that young person's well-being over time? So if you knew that about them and you cared about the young person, you would need to minister to the parents. Because that relationship, the quality of that relationship is so critical. Even when a teenager says, I don't want anything to do with my mom, you should hear my dad. Okay, I get it. I hear you. But the reality is the relationship is really important to your well-being. So if you want to minister in an area that maybe is underserved in this space, it would be a ministry to parents. All right, so I'm back to contextualizing the gospel, and I'll close here. The process whereby Christians adapt the forms, content, and praxis of the faith to communicate it to the minds and hearts of people with other cultural backgrounds. And this is where I want you to be thinking of the gay community as a culture. So in your handout, moving forward, these last two things to do. What steps can I take after this conversation to continue growing in my understanding of people's experiences? I'll read more. I'll discuss with others who maybe attended this time together. How can I challenge any assumptions or beliefs that no longer serve me as a Christian engaging this topic and the people represented by it? So maybe take some time later tonight or at the end of this weekend even to sit with your answers, and which were easy for you to answer, which were more challenging, what surprised you the most as you went through it. Maybe that could be helpful to you. All right, so I'm going to wrap up there, and I think we're going to move into some Q&A.
Thanks, Mark. Well, Mark, we were planning on asking you a bunch of questions, but you asked us a bunch of questions.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Turn the tables on you. Yeah.
That's what I said. The answers might not be the ones you want, but the ones you need. So we only have a few minutes, but so this will consider everything we ask speed round at this point.
Okay, speed round. Got
but
it.
the part that stood out to me that was really helpful, I mean, both the posture that you talked about again and again, and then the phrase I would use is imagination when we think through these lenses, and how we need to develop a pastoral imagination for contextualizing the gospel, especially seeing through the diversity lens, so that we can reach people in that, especially if it's foreign to us. I deeply appreciate that. I mean, I try to do this every week. Question being, how do we do that in such a way? Do you have any safeguards on how to do that? I'm thinking Romans chapter 12, right? There are parts of the culture that we don't want to be conformed to, and obviously we see, as a pastor and leaders, I'm sure we see lots of people just moving wholesale to capitulation and towards a diversity lens. How do we appreciate that and have safeguards and any suggestions or recommendations on that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think when you see people capitulating, keep in mind that the natural human tendency is to go the other extreme. If they're capitulating, I need to go harder in the other direction, and that takes you into warrior stance. So I think to guard your heart about becoming a warrior as a response to capitulation. So I think that the discipline here, and this is there's two qualities I think that mark a good person in ministry in this space, and one is accompaniment, and the other is restraint. So I'm going to accompany a young person navigating this space, and the restraint is I'm not going to allow my reaction to capitulation drive me into the other side of warrior. Restraint says no. There's another way, a better, higher way towards the good that God has towards this. Remember, I think a little bit. I think about this in terms of narrative. What is the story you are reading from about this person? Who is this person to God? So when I meet with people, they often say, the name I was given through my church growing up, indirectly through things that were said, was I'm an abomination. So the corrective, of course, is what is a word that God has for this group of people? And I would say this group of people is beloved by God. He wants a relationship with them. That's why I said, if you're going to minister to this population, you have to love this population, because God has a heart for this population in the sense that he wants to bring all people to himself. So if that's true for them, I heard another Christian speaker once say this, like in her neighborhood, three houses down is a gay man who does not know Christ. 2 houses down is a straight man who does not know Christ. Neither one of them knows Christ. You're not further away from God by virtue of being gay. In a sense, it's a demographic characteristic over here. This person's agnostic or atheist, like they don't know God. So I mean, it's you got to get past the gay part into the God loves this person part. I think that would be a big help.
So obviously we have to do this the work in our own hearts first.
Yeah,
starts with us, and I know at least in our congregation, our leaders are actively doing this. Any recommendations on? I mean, you described the dad that you had to kind of coach on how he responded. Any recommendations? Because it does trigger people deeply. Even knowing that you came, I received an email that was I was embarrassed for the man. It was scathing, the idea that we would even have this conversation, because he thought we were capitulating in having you. So any recommendations on? I mean, I'm sure you face this all day long, on how to point with the sword and help disarm and help move people along in that conversation.
So, okay, one thing I would probably do, and thank you for not forwarding that to me. I get enough email. That's one less that I have to. I think what I do is I introduce them to the 3 lenses, and I invite them. So let's say that person's staunchly in that first lens of integrity, but also holding it, that sword of truth in a very weaponized way. And I think I'd want to just invite, if I laid out all 3, and said, here's how I see, even Christians landing in these different spaces for different reasons. Which resonates for you? And he said it was over here. I think what I'd want to do is spend some time listening to how this came about.
Yeah.
What are the experiences and influences and modeling and sense of conviction that came about that is the one that resonates? And then how do you embody that? How does that come from you? How's that exuded? What's that look like for ministry in your life? I'd want to just exhaust and patiently listen so that the person could listen to other possibilities. Mm-hmm. Or maybe why other people might see that as there's a point of diminishing returns in that. So I would be, respectful, as I'm not like trying to say that person's the problem. I'm saying they probably got there somehow, and they're very much in a very adamant position that probably has some explanation to it. And I'd like to think through from a ministry standpoint, because I'm also ministering to this person. How did they get there is a ministry question, because that posture's probably could do more damage to a lot more people. And I'd like to attend to that. And it might be damaging right now to their heart. And I just, so I'd want to do that to see if we could understand it better and maybe bring some healing.
Helpful. Let's go ahead and, if you guys have take a question or two from the audience here.
Hi. I'm not part of this church, so I appreciate being here. What I appreciate even more is the courage that this church is having this conversation. There are so many churches and pastors that wouldn't even go anywhere near this. That's why they're not here tonight. And a lot of folks don't know how to do this. And that you're asking these questions, even if you don't have all the answers yet, is okay. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for starting this conversation in your church.
Anyone else want to, jump in?
Thank you. I have a gay son who married a gay girl. Their marriage is amazing today. So many women that I minister to, I am a minister, been for a long time. Many women my age, their children are coming out to them. They look to me, talk to me because I have had a gay son. But my condition is that he is married to so I don't know how to minister to fellow parents of gay adult people because they're in your category of, you're sinning, you cannot, and then the children actually are made to leave the house. Mm-hmm. As a person, they come to me, but I don't know how to encourage them. What does love look like? I try to tell them love looks like this, I thought, when my son was growing up. But it's hard to minister to them because my son is married to a female now. Yeah. So help. Help me help
So just solve
them.
that, will you?
Yeah. Well, I think your posture is a very common one, which is you're trying to draw on your personal experience as your only resource for helping another parent. So I think your personal experience is very unique, and I think you'd have to kind of, in a sense, set that aside. Maybe there's some common principles that you learned about loving your son that could help another couple, but it might be more helpful to listen to the challenges they're facing and say, okay, maybe this could be an opportunity for reading and hearing the voices of other Christian parents who have a very different experience than you do, but they still come to you because they sense there's a credibility to your background by having a gay son that you have a foot in the door, an opportunity that other people wouldn't have. But yes, I can see where you wouldn't necessarily know this doesn't map onto your experience, but here's what I've learned. So we did a study of several hundred Christian parents whose kids came out to them. And what Christian parents would say to other Christian parents is they're essentially saying, keep as many doors open as possible to the relationship. I think many Christian parents feel a great burden between loving their child and having a response that does not displease God. And so they're constantly feeling that tension of, if I love my child, am I being disloyal to God? If I'm loyal to God, does that mean I can love my child? Even ministry to, and I think most parents would have at least had to deal with this piece of it, helping them understand that that's a very common experience, and to have a listening ear and a willingness to engage and to hear and pray for that tension, because that has to be resolved by every parent. And I do think God calls parents to love that child. Like that impulse to do so is, I think, from God. And I don't think we're being disloyal when we do that. Now, it gets into some wisdom questions. What does that mean if my son marries another man? Or what does that mean if they have a ceremony? Or what does that mean if they have children through adoption? Like, there's a lot of future questions, and many Christian parents borrowed from the future in their anxiety than just being right here. So another ministry tip would be what Scripture teaches us, which is to allow the anxieties of our day to be the things in front of us and to bring those in prayer, and to not borrow anxieties from the future, which is a very easy thing to say but very hard to do. But I think those are some steps that I would take. There are resources for, I said there weren't many, but there are some resources for Christian parents. So we have a resource that's based on hundreds of parents' experiences, kind of walking through their relationship with their loved one. And I will say that most of those relationships improve over time. They're usually hard in the very beginning. There's less communication, less authenticity, less sense of connection, but that improves over the next 4 or 5 years, which is a long time. And a lot of those start with conflict with Christian parents, and that comes down over the next 4 or 5 years. So things get better, but it might be good for those parents to read the path, how other parents have navigated that, and how their faith was challenged, how the relationship was challenged, but that others have gone through it. And maybe a book like that could be helpful.
Well, if you're like me, you have a million more questions, and you just brought up a number of them.
Yeah, probably.
Attending, your child's getting married at a gay wedding. What do you do? Do you attend? Do you not? I mean, those types. And then your kids are at a school that are being taught from a very different perspective of, celebration in every way. How do you navigate that? But the good news is we have Mark tomorrow morning and tomorrow night. So if you guys want to come back, we'd love to have you come back then to ask more questions. And we'll have an extended Q&A time tomorrow night, 6 p.m. So